In this video, I'm going to be continuing my socket chisel project. If you're not familiar with this project, I'm basically trying to figure out the best way to forge an 8-sided socket for a set of chisels I want to make. So if you're interested in that idea, stay tuned. Hi, I'm Dennis Frechette, and welcome back. Today I have part 2 of my socket chisel project. If you haven't seen part 1, I'll have a link for that in the description. These are common woodworking chisels. They're not metalworking chisels, but I'm concentrating on trying to create a really nice octagonal shaped socket as opposed to a round socket. And this is not a common shape. I've never had an opportunity to buy one, and I haven't even been able to find a picture of one, but I have seen them in museums. I guess they were common between, the 15th to the 17th century, something like that. They're a very, very old style of chisel, but they're really neat looking, and I want to make them. So fortunately, I'm a blacksmith and I can figure that out. So that's what I have for you today, and hope you find it interesting. I'm going to be making the socket for this chisel out of a 3-inch long piece of 1-inch square pipe. In the first video, I created the socket by wrapping and forge welding the edges of a wedge-shaped piece of flat bar into a tapered socket. This time I can skip over that step because the square pipe that I'm using today is exactly the right size for the socket that I'm going to be making. The first step in the process is to create a square tapered pipe. I'm using a swage block to forge this pipe mainly because the shape of the swage is going to support the faces while I'm hammering on the corners of the pipe. You don't need the swage block to hammer out this shape. You can do it all on the anvil if you want. It just makes it a lot easier. The big advantage of forging this taper into the pipe is that I'm basically upsetting the edges of the 4 flat bars that make up this pipe. So as that end of the pipe gets narrower, the wall thickness is going to get thicker. And that's exactly what I want when I get to forge welding this socket to the bar that's going to make up the chisel. The final shaping is done over a mandrel, and this mandrel was made specifically to make these chisels, so the angle is exactly the angle that I'm looking for the taper of the socket. And I discussed how to make this mandrel in the first video. So here I'm further along, and you can see how the octagonal shape is developing. It's important to get this socket as close to an octagonal shape as possible because the final step in the process is to file nice, sharp, clean edges around the entire socket. So if the socket isn't truly octagonal, you're going to be filing in thin areas as you develop the outside shape. Here I've taken an angle grinder and cut notches into each of the corners of the narrow end of the socket. When I'm forge welding the socket to the bar, these notches are going to allow the flat faces of the socket to be forged down to the flat faces of the square bar that I'm using for the shank of the chisel. The only modification that I need to do to the bar is to upset the ends slightly. This thicker end will provide a stop that I need to keep the socket from sliding off the end of the bar when I move it into position for forge welding. Here I'm just fine-tuning the shape of the taper so that it jams into the socket at exactly the right place. Here I'm getting ready for the weld. I'm taking a wire brush and cleaning off all of the scale from the end of the bar, and I'm making sure that it has a really good coating of flux. This is the last time I'm going to be able to reach this area with flux. I want to make sure that the setup is right. I'm not going to be able to wire brush the inside of the socket, of course, so when it was cold, I took a file and removed all of the scale that was at the narrow end of the socket. And then I slid the socket in position on the bar, and I'm going to let the thick layer of flux on the bar coat the socket. And the last thing that I need to do is make sure that the narrow end of the socket is in full contact with the bar. And once that's done, I can take my first welding heat. And if all is well, over the next couple of welding heats, you should see everything just turn into one bar. The final step in the forging process is to take a very light hammer and just carefully refine all of the faces of the taper. The forge welding process has created kind of an exaggerated taper right where the socket meets the main bar. So I'm basically just trying to refine that curve and to make sure that the socket is still sitting in the center of the bar. So here's the final forging. I was kind of going for a more regular octagonal shape, but I kind of like the 4 wider sections and the 4 narrower sections on the corner. So I think I'm going to keep that look.